On this episode of What the Ship, we look at the shipping situation in the Black Sea and the Red Sea. We'll discuss the labor negotiations going on along the U.S. East and Gulf Coast ports. We'll talk about the Biden and Trump administration's views toward offshore oil and wind. And finally, we'll look at U.S. LNG exports. I'm your host, Sal Mercogliano. Welcome to this week's episode. We're back on track with a weekly What the Ship. We're going to cover the top 5 maritime stories as of January 5th, 2025. If you're new to the channel, hey, take a moment, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell so be alerted about new videos as they come out. So one of the biggest stories over the past week has been the plight of the tanker Eagle S. This is the Cook Island tanker that was outbound out of Russia, coming through the Gulf of Finland when the ship dragged its port anchor and snatched up a series of cables between Estonia and Finland. Finland ordered the vessel to stop. They eventually boarded the vessel, ordered the ship into Finnish waters, and are now at this point conducting an inspection of the vessel. This is the first story from G-Captain. Finland begins port state inspection on detained Eagle S. This is from Bloomberg. Finland began a so-called port state control inspection. I'm not sure why they call it so-called. This is a very typical inspection of the detained Eagle S tanker that's being held after undersea cable ruptures last week, seeking a probe if the vessel meets international safety norms. Under the UN Convention of the Law of the Sea, there are a series of memorandum of understandings between nations that allow countries to conduct what are called port state control inspections. This is not, again, I don't know why they call it so-called. Finland is inspecting the vessel to ensure it meets with all the requirements. It is registered, it has insurance, it is classified. In other words, there's an outside classification agency that's doing it. Now, there's a bit of a question about whether Finland could have stopped this vessel, and in my determination, Finland can stop the vessel. The ship is entitled to what's called innocent passage. Under Article 19 of UNCLOS, you have the right of innocent passage. However, if you're not doing an innocent passage, if you're doing something that is not innocent, in this case, dragging your port anchor and ripping up fiber optic cables and electrical cables on the ocean surface, that's not innocent. And so Finland had every right. Finland asked the vessel to stop. The vessel did stop. They then boarded the vessel. They then sent on a security detachment and had the ship sail into Finnish waters. Now, there's some confusion here about what happens next. This story from Reuters: Finnish court upholds seizure of Russian oil tanker amid cable probe. There was an effort by a lawyer, a Finnish lawyer, hired by the shipping company. We don't know what he looks like. We'll assume this is him. But he came before a Finnish court and asked the ship to be released so that it would not be iced in and stuck, because that would do undue harm to the vessel and the crew. The Finns said no to that, and understand the ship is just currently being held. If, however, the ship is arrested, and yes, ships can be arrested. Ships are treated in admiralty law like human beings. They can be held susceptible for damage. And if the owners of the pipelines and the undersea cables and the electrical cables determine that damage was done, then they can hold the ship and cargo responsible, in which case the ship would be arrested. And if the company did not make the restitutions, then the cargo and ship could be sold so that restitutions could be had. Now, this is not new. We have been seeing an escalation in what has been happening in the Baltic. This story from Reuters gives you a good timeline of what happened. So obviously we have the cutting of the internet and power cables here by Eagle S in December. Back in November, we saw the Baltic telecom cables being severed. This happened on November 17th and 18th. This was the actions by the Chinese bulk carrier Yiping 3 after the ship left the Russian port of Ust-Luga on November 15th. The ship was held in international waters between Denmark and Sweden. The Chinese flag state, which is where the ship was registered, did an inspection on board with Swedish officials in accompanying them. However, no guilt was found and the ship was allowed to sail, and the ship is now sailing out in the Atlantic. Back in October of 2023, there was the Baltic Connector gas pipe and cables. This is when New Polar Bear dragged its anchor on October 8th of 2023. I did a video on this, talked about the fact that this looked like it may have been an accident. However, obviously, the number of occurrences of this makes it extremely disturbing. And then the largest one that we had was back in September of 2022 with the Nord Stream blast. These appear to have been explosions based on what has been found underneath there. Sweden detected the undersea blasts about 17 hours apart on September 26th. Of 2022. Sweden subsequently found traces of explosives. Both Sweden and Denmark closed the investigation without naming suspects. Russia blamed the US, Britain, and Ukraine for the blasts. Germany asked Poland to arrest a Ukrainian diving instructor because of their suspicion that they were involved. Nord Stream is a mess. I don't know who is the ultimate culprit for Nord Stream, but what we are seeing right now is increased polarization and attention being made on this subject. I also want to note something else, and I'll bring this up over on marine traffic. So whenever an event happens, there are people who get on marine traffic and all these other AIS that track vessels, and all of a sudden they make discoveries and they post it out on social media like this is the end of the world. I give you this cluster of ships located here in the Gulf of Finland. The amount of people who have posted this and are talking about that the Finns are corralling Russian ships is completely wrong. This is a normal anchorage. This anchorage has been in use. I tracked it all the way back to 2019. This is an anchorage for ships waiting to come into Ust-Luga over here in Russia, up to the facility up here in Primorsk, and also over here to Tallinn. I think I said this right. I mispronounced it last time, and I had a lot of people comment about it. I think it's Tallinn in Estonia. This is not the Finns corralling vessels. However, you will notice more Finnish and Estonian vessels out here patrolling. That is a definite mark up. And what we're seeing is the Danes, the Finns, the Swedes, and really all the Baltic states. We're bringing back the Hanseatic League people. Are doing much more patrolling in the area, and that has to do with the fear that we may see something happen again. Now we shift over to the Black Sea, where Russia is putting in an emergency after the number of oil spills being caused by the loss of the 3 tankers. You may remember we did a series of videos, 212, 239, and the 109, all broke up and sank. This has caused a oil spill that has occurred in Crimea and off the Kerch Peninsula, and obviously Russia is dealing with that. They have declared an emergency in that area. And then lastly, we have the report on Arctic shipping coming out, where Russia has set a new record with 38 million tons shipped along the North Sea route. This is up from 2023 when they shipped about 35 million tons, but it is a tenfold increase from 2014 where they shipped just 3.7 million tons. What we've largely seen is the average has been roughly around 30 million tons since 2019. However, we know Russia has laid out this new North Sea route development plan for 2035. They are trying to see an uptick in the amount of shipping in that region. They hope to eventually increase it up to about 270 million tons by 2035. This is Russia using a route that is substantially shorter. If you sail from Europe to Asia, you avoid the Suez Canal, you avoid the Red Sea, you avoid the Bab el-Mandab, you avoid the Indian Ocean, the Straits of Malacca, a lot of choke points. However, it is constrained by weather. Obviously, you're sailing in the Arctic, you need icebreakers. This is why Russia builds so many icebreakers. It is also constrained by environmental issues, but more importantly, Russia wants this route to ensure trade with China and also an access for its oil and liquefied natural gas coming out of the Arctic fields. All right, let's go ahead and head over to story number 2. Story number 2 takes us to the U.S. East and Gulf Coast ports with the resumption of negotiations between the International Longshoremen's Association and the U.S. Maritime Alliance. Did a story on this last week, but we have further on it this week. This story over at GCAP by Bloomberg. Maersk sees no progress in U.S. port talks. Now, I should note that my hearing on this topic is that the negotiations resume on Tuesday, January 7th. Everything looks good for a potential agreement. There are two companies, shipping companies in the U.S. Maritime Alliance who do have some reservations, and by no weird coincidence, one of them is Maersk. And so Maersk is highlighting this issue. They're also sending out announcements, as all the firms are, that if you have cargo in the East and Gulf Coast ports, try to get it out before January 15th in case the ports do close. If you caught my earlier episode on this, I said there's probably 3 resolutions to this that we can expect to see. 1, we have a deal. This goes away, no issue, boom, keep on trucking. Number 2, they don't reach a resolution by January 15th. We have a strike. I think that's a very low possibility. I put it at 10%. I'm sure that if it's wrong, everyone will highlight how wrong I am. That's fine. But I do think it's the low potential. The deadline is on January 15th. That's a Wednesday. The inauguration is January 20th. That's Monday. So if you have a strike, it's going to be the second half of a week, much like we saw last time. I think it would be a few days, and then they would be back at the table to talk about this. The third issue, and I think the one that may be the most likely right now, is we get an extension. And the reason I think we get an extension is because of this. This is the Drewry Index. One of the things you're seeing here as of 2 January, that the Drewry World Container Index is up 3% to $3,905 per 40-foot container. If you look at their breakdown by routes, you can see that nearly every one of the major 4 routes they look at, Shanghai to Rotterdam, Shanghai to LA, Shanghai to Genoa, and to New York, are all up and climbing. This means that the ocean carriers are actually doing well. Their rates are coming back up. And so maybe a resolution to this conflict is not in their best interests. The other issue you see, this is from Container News, is that the box lines are anticipating the strike by slapping U.S. East Coast surcharges on shipping containers. I have to say, I got in a little bit of a discussion on LinkedIn with Lars Jensen, who is the premier container expert in the world. There's no one who knows containers better than Lars. So if I'm going to get spanked by someone, it might as well be Lars. However, I do have a qualm with this, in that the container companies are slapping a ridiculous amount of surcharges right now for a myriad of reasons. Again, go back to this. Just note on the side here that CGM is applying postseason surcharges from the Indian subcontinent, Middle East, Gulf, Red Sea, and Egypt to the U.S. East Coast, the U.S. Gulf Coast. They're also doing it from the Mediterranean to the U.S. East Coast and Gulf. When you break down the Linerlytica story, you'll see that they're talking about quite a few surcharges are being leveled at this time. Maersk Line has a surcharge of $1,500 per 20-foot unit, $3,000 per 40-foot, $3,780 for a 45-footer. CGM is imposing a surcharge of $800 per TEU, $1,000 per FEU for exports, and an import surcharge of $1,500. Hapag-Lloyd has a work disruption surcharge of $850 per TEU and $1,700 per FEU. They're also doing a work interruption destination surcharge of $1,000. So Linerlytica noted this: China to U.S. freight rates have recovered all their losses from the previous 6 weeks, with further strength expected in the coming weeks ahead of a potential U.S. East Coast port strike. Carriers will be imposing emergency U.S. East Coast surcharges of up to $1,000 to $2,000 per FEU 40-foot equivalent unit if the strike goes ahead, with U.S. West Coast rates also expected to spike due to cargo diversions. Again, early March, we have the TPM conference out on the West Coast at Long Beach, where carriers will be negotiating with shippers for the year-long rates. Remember, a lot of the charts I show you are spot rates. These are the rates you get if you try to ship a container right now. This is what the rates are. However, about 60 to 70% of all cargo is shipped by long-term rates. And if the rates are high, that means they can get higher long-term rates. And that may be a part of the equation that we don't always hear in these negotiations. Everyone wants to blame the ILA for being Luddites. However, the other aspect here is the U.S. Maritime Alliance and the role they play. All right, let's go ahead and look at our third story. Story number 3 takes us to the Red Sea and our good old friends, the Houthi, with a series of strikes being executed by both the United States and the Israelis. This story over at G Captain, I can't help but notice that my cookies are really showing myself here with my shirt selections down here. This story of G Captain Mike Schiller. U.S. forces strike Houthi weapon facilities and radar sites in Yemen amid Red Sea tensions. We had been talking for a while here about the fact that the U.S. had shifted the Truman battle group north in the Red Sea. That led to the Houthi, and a lot of Houthi followers sitting there saying that they've run an American aircraft carrier out of the region. That's not what happened. Instead, what the American aircraft carrier and its strike group did was get out of the way, because all of a sudden what we saw was the Israeli strike at the Houthi. On December 31st, at UN, Israel warns Houthis risk same fate as Hamas and Hezbollah. This goes into a larger story where the Israelis want the Houthi designated as a terrorist outfit by the UN. The Israelis have hit the Houthis quite hard in and around the area. There seems to be an uptick in action by the Biden administration against the Houthi. You may remember that we had a large presence early on with the Eisenhower strike group, and then the Eisenhower strike group turned everything over to the European Union's Operation Speeds, but then we've had reports directly from the commanders of Operation Speeds that they lack the resources, the forces to do escorts through the region. And now what we see is a renewed effort by the Truman strike group hitting this area. We just had the Charles de Gaulle carrier battle group come through. They did not do strikes, which is very interesting to me, even though the French Marine Nationale is heavily involved in the escorting of vessels through the region. They did not undertake any strikes in the area. But what we're seeing is largely a coordinated effort here by the United States and the Israelis to hit the Houthi. Not sure if this is the final farewell of the Biden administration trying to resolve this before the Trump administration comes in, but it is an interesting development. But by far, the most interesting development regarding the Houthis has to be this story here. The Houthis planned a Red Sea security seminar. Yes, really. Okay. The Houthis are calling for a security seminar on the Red Sea. So let's break this down just a little bit here. After a year of drone and missile attacks against the merchant and naval vessels, the Iran-backed Houthi rebel group is now extending an olive branch of sorts by planning a seminar and webinar on security of navigation in the Red Sea. In an unexpected twist, the group has apparently reached out to industry insiders for agenda ideas and insights to enrich the discussion. The email sent to Tradewinds by an events manager for the Humanitarian Operations Coordination Center is raising eyebrows across the shipping community. HOCC is the same entity that has issued threats to shipping companies and ship owners, including warnings this year that vessels failing to cooperate with Houthi authorities would be banned from crossing the Red Sea. Okay, I have not received my invite from the Houthi to go to this security seminar. I don't know. That would be an interesting one. To attend the Houthi security seminar, I'm really tempted on that one. I'm really, really tempted to attend it would be amazing to hear the Houthi talk about it. I obviously would have to keep my friggin' mouth shut if I don't get killed by the Houthi. But it's an interesting plight. Again, the Red Sea is suffering a 40% reduction in the number of ships going through. Most of the major shipping firms have announced that they expect the first half of 2025 to continue the diversions around the area. Story out that Egypt is suffering $7 billion of loss in tolls through the Suez Canal. This is creating massive disruptions. And as I talked about in an earlier video where we talked about the ILA and the U.S. Maritime Alliance, this is also artificially inflating those container rates. The reason we see those container rates up higher than usual is because of this diversion around. All right, let's go ahead to our fourth story. Story number 4. So if we talk about the difference between the Biden and Trump 2.0 administration, there are many facets that you can look at. But one of the things developing in regards to shipping has to do with offshore oil and wind. This story over in GCAP from Bloomberg, Biden to block more offshore oil drilling before Trump arrives. This goes hand in hand With this story, Biden to ban new oil drilling over a vast stretch of U.S. Atlantic and Pacific waters. So we're definitely seeing the Biden administration trying to put in place provisions to prevent the expansion of oil drilling offshore. Now, this really hasn't been a massive issue recently because of fracking. However, as fracking kind of reaches its natural progression here, there may be more of a push to go back to offshore oil drilling. At the same time, the Biden administration is advancing wind leasing. This is offshore wind farms. You see this story, Biden administration advances offshore wind leasing in Guam. And then the administration is forging ahead with offshore wind developments despite Trump threats. The Trump administration has come out not as a big fan of wind, much more in favor of oil. And this story kind of builds on that. Trump to Britain, ditch the windmills and open up the North Sea. So it's going to be interesting to see what legislation the Biden administration puts in place to restrict oil drilling offshore and put in place all the provisions for wind farms. Wind has been a major issue. It's been a hard development. The costs associated with wind farms offshore has risen dramatically. The number of vessels available for putting in wind farms is limited. You have issues with the Jones Act in the United States, but there's just a limited number of vessels that can do this no matter what worldwide. Wind offshore has expanded. You see a lot of wind farms being developed in Europe and in Asia. You are competing against them. There's been an attempt to try to build those in the United States, but because we don't build that many ships in the United States, it has been extremely costly. At the same time, oil development offshore was a big issue years ago because one of the things that the oil industry was able to do was avoid the Jones Act and get a lot of oil platforms that were working in U.S. waters to be foreign registered. For example, if you look at Deepwater Horizon, which was a vessel, it wasn't a firm platform that actually floated Deepwater Horizon, hence its sinking. Deepwater Horizon was registered in the Marshall Islands. It was not in the United States. And so you have a vessel that was offshore registered. And so the maritime industry wants to ensure protection of the wind sector, but at the same time, the wind sector is running into a lot of obstacles, both cost-wise and making it efficient. And so I guarantee this will be a big topic as the Trump administration comes in to see what the Biden administration leaves them. All right, let's go ahead to story number 5. Story number 5 deals with liquefied natural gas and its export from the United States. The U.S. has become the largest exporter of liquefied natural gas. That number kind of flips around between the United States, Qatar, and Australia. But this story over in Bloomberg, LNG exports grow at the slowest pace since 2015, data shows. But even with that slow pace, you have this story from Reuters. U.S. LNG exports soar in December, lifting full-year growth by 4.5%. So U.S. LNG exports reached new record level in December, rising to 8.5 million metric tons as 2 new plants started and driving up full-year shipments 4.5% over 2023. December's output was just short of the record export of 8.6 million tons recorded in December 23 and was 9% higher than the 7.75 million tons exported in December. For the year, LNG exports hit 88.3 million tons. That's up 84.5 million tons in 2023. The China Energy LNG.N startup of its Stage 3 expansion at Corpus Christi and the Venture Global LNG launch of its Plaquemines plant in Louisiana are expected to add 30 million tons annually to U.S. annual output. Obviously, the export of LNG becomes extremely important with Ukraine turning off the Russian natural gas pipeline that runs across its territory. That means there will be a shortage of natural gas in Europe. American LNG is ripe to be sold into Europe. For a long time, the U.S. was selling the vast majority of its LNG to Asia, to South Korea, to Japan, and China. However, what we've seen is a realignment of that. A lot more American LNG is going into Europe. A lot more Qatar LNG is heading to Asia, largely because you don't want to sail LNG carriers through the Red Sea and get a missile on you from the Houthi or a drone. You really don't want to be on a ship hit by an explosive with liquefied natural gas on board. It's not good. It's a big bang. It's really, really not good. I hope you enjoyed this week. Before we go, I want to give one quick shout out to the crew of the U.S. Coast Guard cutter Polar Star. Polar Star set sail from Sydney, Australia for the annual resupply of McMurdo Station. This departure marks the vessel's 28th voyage to Antarctica, and this is an epic voyage. Polar Star is the last heavy icebreaker the U.S. has. Its sister ship, the Polar Sea, has been basically laid up and cannibalized for parts to keep Polar Star operational. To appreciate the scale of this voyage, here is Polar Star and Marine Traffic sailing from Sydney, Australia, and arriving in the Ross Sea off McMurdo Station and the ice shelf. This is an amazing event, happens annually. I actually had an opportunity to participate in this. It's incredible to go down there. It's really freaking cold, even though it's summertime down there. But to have the Coast Guard leading the convoy down there, you usually bring a tanker in to provide fuel. You fill up the fuel bladders for the year, and you bring in a cargo ship, a container ship, self-sustaining container ship, to offload cargo for McMurdo, and you actually, the most unglamorous part of that trip, pick up the trash and bring the trash out of McMurdo Station. Remember, the way you find Antarctica, leave Antarctica. So it's a really epic voyage. So semper paratus to the crew on board Polar Star. I hope you enjoyed this week's episode. If you did, hey, take a moment, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell so be alerted about new videos as they come out. Leave a comment, share it across social media, and if you can, support the page. How do you do that? You hit the super thanks button down below, or head on over to Patreon and become a monthly, yearly subscriber. New episodes coming out. Our next Shipping 101 should be dropping this week. We're going to be talking about container ships. Until then, this is Sal signing off.